So the place we're going to start is someplace where I always start, which is my favorite economist, John Kenneth Galbraith, who in 1958 was clever enough to identify the fact that literacy was the single most important determinant of economic progress. The problem is that the boneheads that work in our Federal Department of Finance didn't believe him, and so don't act in a way that reflects this fundamental truth. And what I've spent most of my adult life trying to do is to prove him right and to change the minds of the people who make decisions about our economic and social development. You're all literacy people, I think, so this will come natural to you, but just a reminder why we care about these things. It's greed, it's fairness, and it's parsimony. The greed part comes from skills as barriers to getting high levels of economic growth, technological innovation, and productivity growth. In Canada, most of the policy discourse is focused on the high end, on PhDs leading us to economic nirvana. Where I've focused my work is on the skill of the average worker to generate economic progress. The second element has to do with the fact that Canada has, of all the countries we've measured in so far, the highest levels of returns to skill. So more of what people earn in Canada, or the differences in what people earn, can be tied back to their literacy levels. This is economically good because it's efficient, second only to the People's Republic of China, but it's bad if you happen to be a person with low skill levels because you will get left behind. And the third thing, we pay for education and health and justice with public dollars, and what we get out of those investments depends very much on the skills of the population being served. Higher literacy levels, less demand on public goods, and lower unit costs of delivering those services. So that is why we care in general. A reminder about why we should care now. The whole story here is the world's changed. For 50 years, Canada has relied on increases in the quantity and quality of education, initial education, to supply skills to the labor market. So there was enough kids staying in school long enough, so skill demand and supply were in rough balance. Unfortunately now, because of our extraordinarily low fertility rates, it doesn't matter, there aren't enough kids no matter what their skill is to satisfy the needs of the labor market. And because of demographics, we're facing an overall labor shortage despite having fairly big immigration. The next bullets are all related. Changes in the global economy mean you can sell to huge markets. So firms that can compete in global markets can get rich to a level not possible 10 years ago. At the same time, firms sitting anywhere in the world can buy all of the inputs at the same prices. And so the playing field is leveled. And they've been investing wildly in education. So now a firm sitting in India or sitting in Singapore or in China can compete on quality and price. And so this results in placing huge pressure on Canadian firms. All right, so if we put a parenthesis around that, we should care, and we should care more now than we did before. We've spent a lot of your tax dollars fleshing out the theory of what skills are, and I'm going to go through this very quickly. The key part of this display is that little depends upon. Things like literacy, numeracy, oral fluency sit at the bottom of a pyramid of acquisition and application. So people that have those things, those tools, to an adequate level, learn faster and can apply those skills better, and the higher order skills in particular. So So as we go up this pyramid, things at the bottom here, government should pay for because they're public goods. Things at the top, firms should pay for. And one of my arguments with the literacy industry is that they've tended to focus exclusively on governments and not enough on firms as the provider of funds to fix the problems we have. So if we keep going, this same chart applies not just to work, but also to the community and to the home. So you can talk about the supply of skills that people bring in each of those domains. And you can also use the same framework to talk about the demand for skill. Because in our conception, literacy is a relative thing, that if what matters is if people have the skills to match the demand that's there in the society. And because I'm an economist, I think like this. We have demand on the left-hand side, created by technological change and changes in social organization in the life course. Here we have skill supply. It's mostly education. About 60% of it's determined by initial education levels and education quality. But we now have data to say that there's a whole lot of stuff that goes on in adulthood that either adds to skills or subtracts from them. And then in a classic economic model, supply and demand meet in markets. So the labor market is the obvious one, but the healthcare system acts as a market, so does the social system and the education system. All highly conditioned on skill. If you have skill, you get access to employment, to health, to democratic process. If you don't, you don't. And because of those markets, you get huge impacts on outcomes. The point I like to make here, apart from the need for balance, is traditionally Canada has paid attention just to the supply. We run our schools, we run our adult education programs, and the presumption is that the market's going to work efficiently and that the demand's going to be there to soak up the skills that we create. It ain't so. So point one for me is that governments have to get rid of their blind faith that the market's going to create the demand. And they have to do some things about those markets. And this is where we have a departure now from what I've talked to some of you about before. I spent 30 years in the naive belief that if we put enough data in front of the key decision makers in government, that they'd make the right choices and change the world. And I've now come to the conclusion that this isn't so. So what we've shifted is our attention to tools for frontline practitioners to make their work better. And I'm going to describe 3 of those things that we're doing, not for making profit, but for doing good. And we're going to drag those politicians and policymakers along by the ear. So I hope you like what you hear. Okay, so now so how do we think about this? What we say is that market that I showed you before is in failure. And markets fail because when market failure, resources aren't allocated efficiently, and most market failures can be traced back to either a lack of tools to identify problems or a lack of information. Okay? So that's what we're trying to do. But there's some broader reasons. Why is there market failure? Why aren't individuals and firms investing to fix this problem that we know is so important? The first is we have at least 50 years of uninterrupted, more or less uninterrupted economic growth, and individuals and firms are lazy and complacent. Until the recession that threw so many people out of work in Ontario, they just didn't realize what the economic risks were. They also haven't realized, sort of related, what the changes in the global economy mean. That in a world where most of what's produced is controlled by multinationals, picking a factory up and moving it to China so you get lower costs is something that happens in a couple of months instead of 20 years. So the rate at which these market changes have become much more rapid, and people just don't appreciate how fast those things are upon us. We've also, despite the efforts of people like me and our extended network of data junkies, there hasn't been a lot of information on the nature of the literacy problem. We have lots of evidence that there's a moral imperative and an economic imperative, but what you do about it and what it would cost and what you'd get in return if you fix the problem, very little. There haven't also been good tools to assess skills that are cheap enough and easy enough to use that they could be used on a widespread basis in firms and in the community. And then one thing that I get in trouble with crowds like this, I am a firm believer that if the literacy industry was a small business, they'd be out of business because they don't think like a small business. They don't think about what the learners need, build products to serve them, market to where those learners are, and so there's a need for the industry to improve. I didn't hear any boos. Right? Okay, so we have 3 products that I'm going to describe. The first is something we're doing. It's HRSDC OLIS funded. It's to build the world's best assessment and instructional system. So I'll talk about that. We've also done a series of what we call a segmentation analysis, which is sort of like the Obama speech we had, except the segments we're defining are what flavors of learners are there in the Canadian market, and what does that imply for what they need, and by extension, what does that mean for what it would cost to fix the problem. And then where I'll spend most of my time is on community level report cards. Part of the market failure is that local firms and politicians at the municipal level haven't got a clue about the impact of this problem on their economic success. Okay, so first the assessment. There's 2 things. There's a web-based adaptive assessment. So adaptive means that the test conditions what test items it gives to you based on your previous responses. So instead of giving a whole bunch of test items and not knowing where somebody is, it zeroes in on them, so you get a fix on them really fast. We have an oral fluency test, a prose literacy test, a document literacy test, a numeracy test, and the decoding and comprehension tests that, for people with weak reading skills, are needed to support fluid and automatic reading. It's affordable. We're trying to make the costs cheaper. TAOS runs anywhere from $66 to $85 a pop. We're talking about costs in the $10 to $15 range. And if we talk about the oral fluency test, it'll be about $25 compared to IELTS, which costs $360, and our test's more reliable. It's flexible, unlike some of the other tools that are around, that you can pick a single domain to look at, or all the domains, or any combination of same. And it's multi-purpose, so it'll do program triage. What level is this person in? So I can put you in a homogeneous class and therefore get more efficient instruction. It can be used as a formative assessment tool to get a program of, set up a learning program, as a summative assessment to figure out at what level someone is at program exit. And if you do both, you can get learning gain and start to feed the accountability and program evaluation needs. And finally, an innovation, a certification test. So if an employer needs an employee at recruitment or for promotion to be certified, in those domains, we'll do that. The second part is what, for me, is the most heartwarming. All of the international assessments are based on a body of evidence about what makes, we'll use reading as the example, adult reading more or less difficult. It's only developed in the 80s, and it's been used extraordinarily extensively around the world to assess people. What we've stumbled on who are people who've been working for the same period of time to use that theory to improve instructional practice. They've been doing that mostly in primary and secondary schools, so offering PD to teachers, and are getting extravagant learning gains. For example, here in Ontario, you're getting EQAO scores to go up 20% with 4 days of PD.